Black CEO denied boarding her own jet 12 minutes. Later, she grounded his entire fleet. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You don't belong here. The words were sharp, venomous, echoing through the sleek, polished floor of the private lounge. The man who said them, a young, white security officer, stood across from her, arms crossed, eyes scanning her from head to toe with blatant skepticism. Vanessa Clark, dressed simply in a tailored black blazer and jeans, carrying only a slim tablet case, was immediately dismissed. She wasn't the flashy CEO they expected. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't a typical day. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire was being humiliated in plain sight, and in 12 minutes, the entire narrative would flip. Vanessa had faced this before. At 23, when they froze her account after her first big commission. At 26, when a loan officer had called her high risk, despite her offering more than enough collateral. But now, she had learned to stay calm in the face of ignorance. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice steady, refusing to flinch. The officer's look of disdain deepened, and he motioned for her to leave. The whispers began to rise, but Vanessa wasn't going anywhere. She calmly reached for her phone and dialed Carla. "Start Protocol 6, she said, her tone controlled and firm. "It's ready, ma'am." Carla replied instantly, her voice unwavering. The shift in the room was palpable. Vanessa's plan was in motion, and no one, not even the security officer, knew what was coming next. Would she give in to their humiliation, or would she show them just how wrong they were? Want to see how this plays out? Click to watch the next chapter of this story. As Vanessa hung up the phone, a calmness settled over her. She had activated the protocol that would ensure justice, but now she had to let it unfold. The private lounge, once quiet, now buzzed with whispers. People were beginning to notice the tension. Vanessa remained seated, her expression unreadable, but the quiet confidence she exuded made her the center of attention. The officer who had dismissed her earlier was still standing at the desk, visibly flustered. His smug demeanor was now replaced by uncertainty, his eyes flickering between the guests and the manager, who had just entered the lounge to see what was happening. The staff was still oblivious to who she truly was, treating her like any other passenger, but they were about to find out. Vanessa's plan had started moving, and there was no turning back. She felt the weight of every second that passed. The air was thick with anticipation. Every word she spoke, every movement she made now carried meaning. She waited, knowing that it wouldn't be long before the truth came crashing down on everyone who had misjudged her. The lounge's hum of nervous chatter grew louder as the manager approached her, his face blank with confusion. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice uncertain. He didn't know who he was speaking to, but Vanessa's eyes remained cold, unwavering. "You'll want to double-check that," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. The manager hesitated, his gaze flicking back to the security officer, who nervously shifted on his feet. Vanessa knew the game had changed. The power had shifted, and she could feel it in every nerve. The manager still had no idea, but he was about to. As if on cue, the door to the lounge opened, and Carla stepped in, walking confidently toward Vanessa. She carried a tablet in her hand, a small smile on her face. "Ma'am, the board has approved your request," Carla said, her voice steady and calm, betraying no sign of the tension that had been building. She turned to the manager and the security officer, her gaze cool and direct. "The CEO is not leaving, and neither are you." The words were simple, but they carried an undeniable force. The manager's face flushed as he processed the information. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, the weight of his mistake now settling on his shoulders. Carla continued, her voice firm as she spoke to Vanessa. "The protocol is in motion. We're handling it from here." Vanessa gave a small nod, her gaze still fixed on the staff. They were all on the verge of understanding the reality of who they were dealing with. The silence in the lounge deepened, a few gasps escaping from the bystanders. The power dynamic was shifting before their eyes, and the staff could only watch as the walls of their complacency crumbled. The security officer, still standing by the desk, finally opened his mouth, but the words that came out were hesitant, almost apologetic. I didn't know," he stammered. Vanessa turned to him slowly, her voice quiet but unmistakable. "You should have known better." The room seemed to hold its breath as the officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room, clearly uncomfortable. Carla stepped forward, her gaze steady. "We'll be conducting an internal review of the staff's actions today, and trust me, there will be consequences." The manager, who had been standing quietly, finally found his voice. "This is highly irregular," he began, but Carla cut him off before he could continue, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What's irregular," she said, "is treating a paying customer like a criminal. What's irregular is failing to see the truth when it's standing right in front of you." She turned to Vanessa, her eyes filled with admiration. "And what's most irregular is underestimating the power of a woman who's built this empire with nothing but grit and determination." Vanessa allowed herself a brief smile, a small victory in the midst of the storm. The room was beginning to understand. The shift had begun. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the force that would tear this institution apart and rebuild it on her terms. The manager's lips pressed together in frustration, but he remained silent, defeated. The tension was palpable, but now it was clear that Vanessa had the upper hand. The CEO wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the people who had disrespected her. Carla's eyes met Vanessa's, and they shared a knowing look. "It's time," Vanessa said softly, and with a small nod from Carla, the next phase of her plan was set in motion. The tension in the lounge was now suffocating. Every eye was on Vanessa, every ear tuned to the hushed conversations that swirled around the room. The staff stood frozen, caught between confusion and the undeniable realization that things were about to spiral out of control. Carla remained at Vanessa's side, her posture unwavering, like a silent sentinel, ready to follow through with whatever needed to be done next. The manager's face was a picture of disbelief as he tried to regain his composure. He was in way over his head, and he knew it. "I don't understand," he muttered, trying to make sense of what was happening. "You're just a guest." The words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong in the space. Vanessa, calm as ever, stood up from her seat and walked toward him slowly, every step echoing in the silence. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The manager opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He seemed unable to process the fact that the woman standing before him wasn't just any guest, but the very owner of the plane, the hotel, and the company. Vanessa's eyes never wavered as she met his gaze. "Let me explain it to you," she continued, her voice steady. "I didn't earn my place here because I was quiet and compliant. I earned it because I refused to let people like you define what I'm capable of." Carla stepped forward, taking the tablet from her hand, and addressed the growing crowd, her voice firm. "We are initiating a full audit of everything that has transpired today," she said, looking directly at the manager, the security officer, and the rest of the staff who had remained silent. "You will all be held accountable for your actions." The manager flinched as if slapped, and the security officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the other employees. They were caught. The weight of their earlier dismissal, their assumptions, their biases, was now crushing them, and it was all being recorded. The room's energy shifted again, the air thickening with the realization that this wasn't just a confrontation, this was a reckoning. Vanessa could feel the power shift under her feet. This wasn't about yelling, about raising her voice. This was about making sure that everyone who had looked down on her, who had assumed she was anything less than the power she was, would understand the magnitude of their mistake. "You think it's enough to just say, 'Sorry?' Think again," she said, turning back to the manager, her words deliberate. "I've spent my life proving myself, and I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else steal the worth of that journey." The security officer, who had been standing near the desk, spoke up hesitantly. "Look, we didn't know who you were. If we had," but Vanessa cut him off, her voice low but piercing. "If you had, you would have treated me with respect," she said, stepping closer. But instead, you assumed I was just another person to push aside. The man looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Carla's voice interrupted the silence again, this time addressing the entire room. This behavior will not be tolerated, she stated, her voice firm. We are working with the Corporate Ethics Board, and an internal review is already in progress. Every word spoken here will be logged and used in the investigation. The murmurs in the lounge grew louder, but now, there was a new tone to them, one of solidarity, of realization. Vanessa wasn't alone in this fight. The manager, unable to hold his ground, began to stammer an apology, but Vanessa didn't let him finish. Save it, she said, her tone final. The damage is done. She turned away from him, her gaze shifting to the other staff members, to the guests who were witnessing this exchange. What happens next will set the tone for every encounter here from now on, she declared. The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation, and as Vanessa walked back toward her seat, she could feel the room shift. The staff had no idea what had just happened, but they would soon learn. The battle for respect had only just begun, and Vanessa was ready to finish what had been started years ago. She was done playing by their rules. Now, it was her turn. The room was charged now, thick with a tension that no one could ignore. Vanessa sat back down, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, assessing every movement, every breath in the room. The manager stood frozen, still processing the weight of the situation. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable shift in his stance, as he realized that the person he had just tried to dismiss was not just any guest. She was the force that could break his career. Carla stood at her side, poised, ready to handle the fallout, but it was clear that Vanessa was in control now. The quiet hum of whispers spread through the lounge like wildfire, as more guests began to realize who she was. Some exchanged knowing looks, others took out their phones, recording the escalating scene. The security officer, now visibly sweating, fumbled with his radio, his eyes darting nervously between Vanessa and the rest of the staff. He had made a mistake, and it was one he would soon regret. Vanessa looked around the room, her gaze slow and deliberate, making sure that every single person in the lounge understood the shift that had just occurred. The atmosphere had gone from quiet confusion to palpable discomfort. She could feel it, every ounce of power returning to her. She had been underestimated, belittled, and now, as the truth settled in, it was clear that the tables had turned. The manager, still hesitant, tried to recover. "We just followed protocol," he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. "We thought," but Vanessa didn't let him finish. "You thought I was just another person to push aside," she interrupted, her voice calm but piercing. "You thought wrong." She stood up again, moving toward him with measured steps, every movement calculated. "I didn't come here to be a token of your convenience, to fit into whatever mold you decided was appropriate. I came here to show you exactly how wrong you were about me." She didn't raise her voice, but the force behind her words made the air feel heavy. The security officer stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment, realizing the gravity of the situation. "We'll be in touch with the corporate office," Carla said, stepping forward, her voice unwavering. "An investigation will begin, and you will all be held accountable for your actions today. Your behavior will not go unnoticed." Vanessa nodded in agreement, her gaze never leaving the staff members. The manager, now visibly shaken, could not respond, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find the words to defend himself. "What you've done here goes beyond poor judgment," Vanessa continued, her voice steady but cold. "You've tried to erase me, dismiss me, and for what? Because I don't fit the image you have in your head of what success looks like." She shook her head slowly, the irony not lost on her. "You have no idea who I am, do you? Let me remind you. I built this empire. Every step I've taken, every inch of success I've earned, has been a battle against people like you who thought they could judge me by the color of my skin, by the way I dressed, by the way I presented myself. And here you are, repeating that same mistake." Carla stepped in again, her presence commanding as she addressed the staff. "You will all be receiving a full review of your conduct," she said, her tone authoritative. "Expect the full weight of corporate scrutiny. And know this, your actions today have consequences. We do not tolerate this kind of behavior." The room fell silent, the weight of Carla's words hanging in the air. Vanessa returned to her seat, a small but satisfied smile playing at the corner of her lips. The staff, now realizing that their authority had crumbled, stood motionless, unsure of how to proceed. Vanessa could feel the shift in the room, how they now saw her, not as just a guest, but as the powerful force that could bring their world crashing down. She wasn't going to let them forget it. "This is just the beginning," Vanessa said, her voice low but unmistakable. "I'm not just here to take back what's mine. I'm here to change the way you view power, the way you see people like me. And trust me, I'm going to make sure this never happens again." The silence was deafening, but there was a sense of quiet victory in the room as the staff realized that this battle was far from over. This moment, this reckoning, would be one they would never forget. The tension in the room had reached its peak, but Vanessa knew it wasn't over yet. The manager, the security officer, and the rest of the staff stood motionless, the weight of their actions now fully sinking in. It was no longer just about her being a guest. It was about the power dynamic they had underestimated. She could see the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization that their careers were hanging by a thread. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching, a figure emerging from the back of the lounge. It was a senior corporate representative, someone Vanessa had been in contact with earlier, a woman who had come to oversee the internal investigation. She walked toward Vanessa with purpose, her gaze meeting the managers and the security officers before finally resting on Vanessa. "I'm sorry for the delay," the woman said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I'm Jane Williams from corporate. We've received full details of the incident, and I'm here to ensure that this matter is handled appropriately." Jane's presence seemed to fill the room, and the staff, who had been standing uncertainly just moments before, now shifted uneasily. Vanessa stood slowly, her posture commanding as she faced Jane. "Thank you for coming," Vanessa said, her voice even but carrying a certain edge. "I trust you'll make sure everything is documented. It's time we hold people accountable for their actions." Jane nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "You have my word," she replied, her gaze turning to the staff. "We will be reviewing all footage, all reports, and interviewing anyone involved. There will be no stone left unturned." The staff, now visibly unsettled, knew that this wasn't just a reprimand, it was the beginning of a full investigation that would change the way the company operated. Vanessa watched as the staff members exchanged glances, their guilt palpable. "You can't just brush this under the rug," Vanessa continued, her voice steady. "Not this time. Not with me." The manager finally spoke, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean for this to go so far," he muttered, his eyes cast downward. "We were just following protocol." Vanessa's eyes locked onto his. "Protocol?" she repeated, her voice low but sharp. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Treating people like they don't belong. You thought you could get away with it because I didn't fit your idea of what success looks like." The manager swallowed hard, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was out now, and there was no denying it. Carla, standing beside Vanessa, stepped forward, her tone firm as she addressed the staff. "This behavior has been reported multiple times. Today, we're not just addressing one incident. We're addressing a pattern of misconduct, and we're going to make sure it's fixed," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. The room was silent again, the weight of Carla's words sinking in. The manager looked around the room, his face pale. He knew that things were never going to be the same for him, or for anyone else who had been part of this system. Vanessa turned her attention back to Jane. "I want every single person involved in this incident to be reviewed. No exceptions," she said. "This cannot happen again. I'm not just asking for accountability, I'm demanding it." Jane nodded, making a note on her tablet. "We'll make sure it's handled swiftly and thoroughly," she promised. Vanessa gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good," she said simply. "And as for the rest of you," she continued, turning back to the staff, "if you think you're just going to walk away from this unscathed, think again." The staff stood in stunned silence, the reality of what was happening beginning to settle in. Vanessa's words had power now, and they knew it. No longer just the dismissed guest. She had turned this situation into a reckoning. The power had shifted completely, and they were left with nothing but the consequences of their actions. As the minutes ticked by, Vanessa felt the weight of her victory settling over her. This wasn't just about one disrespectful moment. This was about rewriting the rules for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. She had reclaimed her power, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. As the silence stretched on, the gravity of the situation began to sink deeper into the staff members. They stood like statues, frozen in their shame, as Vanessa calmly surveyed the room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of their collective ignorance hung heavy in the space. Carla stood beside Vanessa, her unwavering stance a silent show of support, her eyes never leaving the staff. The corporate representative, Jane, was already taking notes, preparing for the thorough investigation that would unfold in the coming days. But even with the wheels of accountability set into motion, Vanessa knew the work had only just begun. This isn't just about what happened today. Vanessa spoke again, her voice steady, but the power in her words was undeniable. This is about the culture that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish. This is about the millions of people who have been treated like I was today, dismissed, ignored, and belittled for no reason other than who they are. Her gaze cut through the staff as she spoke, each word directed like a weapon. And let me make one thing clear, she continued, her voice cold as steel. This will not be tolerated, not in my presence, not in this company. The manager opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Vanessa's eyes locked with his. You had a choice today, she said, her voice quiet, but with a razor-sharp edge. You chose to ignore me. You chose to assume things about me based on my appearance, and you chose to treat me like I didn't matter. You're lucky I didn't walk away, but now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your actions. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the guests in the lounge and the corporate representative. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. He had no defense, and he knew it. Vanessa turned to Jane, who had been quietly observing. I trust the investigation will be thorough? Vanessa asked, her tone nonchalant, but her words held a quiet intensity. Jane nodded, her expression serious. We will do everything by the book, she said, her voice firm. Every staff member involved will be interviewed, and the investigation will include a full review of their past actions. This behavior ends now. Vanessa gave a small nod, her gaze briefly flickering to the staff, now all too aware of what was happening. Good, she said simply. I'm not just here to make sure this doesn't happen to me again. I'm here to make sure it never happens to anyone else. As the minutes passed, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Instead, it thickened, the truth settling into every corner. The staff had tried to assert their power over Vanessa, to diminish her based on their assumptions, their prejudices, and their bias. But now, they were confronted with the reality of their own failure. Vanessa, in that moment, wasn't just a CEO. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman, she was a force, and she would not be ignored. She had reclaimed her power, and was now reshaping the very system that had tried to diminish her. The silence was punctuated only by the sound of Carla's tablet as she logged every moment of this exchange. What happens next? Vanessa said slowly, her eyes scanning the staff one final time, is that you will all learn a very hard lesson. And if you think you can go back to business as usual after this, think again, because this is just the beginning of the change that's coming. The manager lowered his gaze, defeated. The security officer stood motionless, his face flushed with shame. The rest of the staff were too stunned to speak, knowing they were caught in the act of their own failure. Jane turned to Vanessa. We'll get started immediately, she said, her voice firm with resolve. Vanessa gave a slight nod. Make sure this is handled swiftly. I expect nothing less than full accountability. This can't just be a lesson for them. It needs to be a lesson for everyone who thought they could get away with this behavior. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. This is how you change a system. This is how you make sure it never happens again. The room was still, almost too still, as everyone processed the gravity of what had just transpired. The manager and security officer were both silent, defeated, unable to meet Vanessa's gaze. Carla, ever the professional, had already begun coordinating the next steps with corporate. Jane, the corporate representative, was standing nearby, taking notes, but even she could not hide the look of shock on her face. She had never witnessed a moment like this, where the power dynamics in a room had shifted so completely, so swiftly. Vanessa stood by herself now, no longer the dismissed guest but the embodiment of justice and power. Her earlier words had struck deep, and it was clear that no one in the room would ever forget them. The staff, who had once held the power, were now left with nothing but their own shame and the knowledge that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. After a long pause, the manager finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper, as though he were trying to avoid any more confrontation. "We didn't mean to," he began, but Vanessa didn't let him finish. "You didn't mean to?" she repeated, her voice colder now. "You didn't mean to treat me like I didn't belong here? To assume I was an imposter? Do you think that excuse will make things right?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no defense. There was nothing he could say to justify his actions, his assumption that Vanessa didn't belong, simply because of the way she presented herself. Vanessa turned to Jane, who had been standing quietly beside her. "I expect a full review of all employees involved," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I want a timeline. This cannot drag on. There needs to be swift action." Jane nodded, her professional demeanor returning. "Absolutely. We will start with immediate interviews and review all footage and documentation from today." Vanessa's eyes didn't leave the manager, who was now visibly sweating, his face pale. "I hope you're ready for the consequences," Vanessa said quietly. The weight of her words hung in the air. The manager shifted uncomfortably, knowing that his career might very well be over. Vanessa had made it clear this was not just a one-time mistake. It was part of a larger system of bias, of systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Carla turned to the staff now, her voice sharp, addressing them all. "We are going to make sure that this doesn't happen again," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Every single one of you will be held accountable, and that includes the management. The fact that this type of behavior was allowed to continue for so long is unacceptable." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. This will be a wake-up call for everyone in this company. The security officer, who had been the one to first challenge Vanessa, shifted his weight nervously. He knew the consequences for his actions were inevitable. "We're going to make sure this incident is documented," Carla continued, her voice firm. "It will be a part of every performance review from now on, and anyone involved in treating guests with bias or prejudice will face disciplinary action." Vanessa turned to Carla, her expression one of quiet approval. "Good," she said simply. "It's time this company took a hard look at itself and stopped hiding behind excuses." She glanced back at the manager, whose face was now flushed with embarrassment. "I won't let this go," Vanessa said, her tone firm. "I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing this for every single person who has ever been treated like they don't belong. This is just the beginning of real change." The silence in the room was thick, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before. It was the silence of realization, of a change that had already begun. The manager, his shoulders slumped, took a step back, knowing that this moment would be a turning point for him, whether he liked it or not. Carla turned to Jane, their eyes meeting briefly. "We'll need to move quickly," Jane said, her voice steady. "This will be a company-wide shift, but we'll need to make sure we're thorough." "We're on it," Carla replied. Vanessa took a slow breath, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to subside. This was her victory, but it was also just the first step in what would be a long journey, a journey she was ready to lead. "Let's make sure this never happens again," Vanessa said, her voice low but resolute. She looked around at the staff one last time, her eyes filled with the kind of power that only comes from standing firm in the face of injustice. And with that, the room began to stir, the shift in the air unmistakable. Change had come, and it wasn't going anywhere. The silence in the lounge remained, but now it felt different. The power had shifted, and Vanessa could feel the tension in the air as the staff stood motionless, processing the weight of what had just happened. The manager, who had once carried an air of authority, was now a shadow of his former self, standing with his shoulders slumped, his face flushed with shame. The security officer, who had first attempted to remove her from the lounge, was nervously shifting from foot to foot, unsure of how to proceed. The rest of the staff, who had quietly supported the manager's actions earlier, now stood in stunned silence, realizing they had all been complicit in the discrimination that had just played out before them. Vanessa could see it in their eyes, the dawning recognition that they had made a grave mistake, one that could not be undone. She stood tall, her expression calm but filled with a quiet authority, knowing that this moment would mark a turning point. She wasn't just reclaiming her power. She was demanding change for everyone who had been pushed aside, dismissed, or treated like they didn't matter. As the minutes ticked by, Jane, the corporate representative, spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension. "We'll be gathering statements from everyone involved, and the full internal audit will begin immediately," she said, her tone firm, professional, but undeniably empathetic. "This is not just about today. It's about a systemic issue within this company. We will address every single instance of bias and prejudice that has been allowed to fester." Carla, who had remained a steady presence throughout the ordeal, stepped forward. "We've already started gathering the necessary information. The entire team will be retrained, and we will implement a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination from this moment forward." Her words were met with a collective silence from the staff, none of them daring to respond. They had no defense. Vanessa turned to Carla, her expression unreadable, but there was an undeniable spark of approval in her eyes. "Good. Let's make sure it's thorough," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. Carla nodded, understanding the gravity of what was being asked. "It will be. We'll make sure it's not just a lesson for today, but a lasting change." Vanessa turned back to the staff, her gaze piercing. "You had your chance to change things. You chose to treat me as less than, simply because I didn't fit the mold you thought I should. You assumed you knew my worth, and you were wrong." She paused, letting the words sink in, her eyes scanning the room. "I won't stand by and let this continue. I'm not just here for myself. I'm here for everyone who has been silenced by people like you." The manager, his voice barely a whisper, spoke again. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." Vanessa cut him off, her tone sharp. "You didn't have to know. You should have treated me with respect from the start. That's the point." The silence grew heavier as the manager's words failed him. He had no excuse, no justification for his actions. Carla stepped forward once more, her tone commanding. "We'll be making a full report to corporate headquarters, and the board will review everything," she said, her eyes now on the manager. "This will be addressed at the highest levels." Jane nodded in agreement. "We won't stop until this is corrected, and we will hold everyone accountable." Vanessa looked around the room one last time, her gaze sweeping across the staff. "This is the last time any of you will underestimate me or anyone else who doesn't fit your narrow view of what success looks like. You will all be held to a higher standard from now on. It's time for change, and it starts today." With that, Vanessa turned to leave, her head held high. The room remained still, the air thick with the knowledge that the power dynamics had shifted. The staff stood there, now fully aware of the consequences of their actions. Vanessa had reclaimed her place not just in the lounge, but in the company, and there was no going back. This was only the beginning. The change she had set into motion would ripple throughout the company, and it would never be the same again. As Vanessa stepped out of the lounge, her steps echoed with purpose. The weight of the confrontation was still settling on her, but she knew this was only the beginning. She had made her point, but the true impact would come later, as the ripples of her actions spread throughout the company. Behind her, the staff remained frozen, their guilt palpable in the air. They were now fully aware that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The change had been set into motion, and there was no going back. Outside, the corporate representative, Jane, followed Vanessa, her voice calm but firm. "We'll be making the necessary reports to headquarters immediately," Jane said, her eyes meeting Vanessa's. "This won't be overlooked, and it will be handled at the highest levels. I assure you, the company is taking this very seriously." Vanessa nodded, her eyes focused ahead. "Good," she said quietly. "I expect nothing less." She didn't need to look back to know that the staff would be facing the consequences of their actions. She had made it clear that there would be no leniency, no second chances for those who had allowed their biases to run unchecked. The change wasn't just going to be a one-time event. It would be a new standard for the company, a standard that respected every individual, regardless of appearance or background. We're not just going to fix the issue at this level, Vanessa continued, her voice steady. This is a company-wide transformation. I want to see accountability from the top down. If anyone thought this kind of treatment was acceptable, they need to understand that those days are over. Jane gave a small, approving nod. Understood, she said. We're already putting in place the framework for the review. The internal audit will begin immediately, and training will be revised across all departments. Vanessa stopped for a moment, turning to face Jane. It's not just about training. It's about creating a culture where this kind of behavior isn't even allowed to start. We have to change the way people think, not just what they do. Jane was silent for a moment, taking in Vanessa's words. You're right, she said, her voice reflecting the shift in her own perspective. This isn't just about addressing individual incidents. It's about addressing a culture. Vanessa's expression softened slightly. Exactly. I've spent my entire life fighting to prove myself. But I shouldn't have to fight for basic respect. No one should. If the company wants to truly move forward, it needs to understand that treating people like they don't belong, based on assumptions and prejudice, will no longer be tolerated. Not now, not ever. Jane nodded again, her determination clear. We'll make sure this change is deep and lasting. We'll start from the ground up. Vanessa's eyes met hers, her voice firm. And make sure no one ever forgets this. Make sure that the people who walked out of that lounge today understand that the moment they let their biases take over was the moment they lost their right to lead. With that, Vanessa turned and walked toward the exit, her presence commanding the space, as if she were the one who had just delivered the final blow. Behind her, Jane took one last look at the lounge, the staff still standing there, unsure of what would come next. Vanessa had made her statement, and now it was time for the company to face the consequences. As Vanessa walked out of the building, the weight of the situation seemed to lighten with every step she took. She had won this battle, but she knew there was still work to be done. This moment, this reckoning, would be a defining point in her journey not just as a CEO, but as a woman who refused to be silenced or sidelined. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was no longer going to play by their rules. She was setting the rules now, and she would ensure they were followed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Vanessa had expected resistance, but the sheer speed at which the company began to shift took even her by surprise. Carla and Jane worked tirelessly, coordinating the audit, gathering evidence, and speaking to those involved. The investigation had been thorough, and the results were just as Vanessa had expected. There were those who had silently participated in the discriminatory actions, and then there were those who had actively fostered the environment that allowed it to flourish. The managers, the security officers, and even some of the higher-ups all were held accountable. But for Vanessa, it wasn't just about firing people. It was about resetting the culture, and that was the hardest part. The review meetings were long, but Vanessa attended each one, making sure every detail was addressed. She wasn't just overseeing the process, she was a part of it, every step of the way, making sure the lessons were learned and that there would be no room for excuses. She knew that true change didn't come from sweeping things under the rug, but from addressing the uncomfortable truths and making them public. At the next company-wide meeting, Vanessa took the stage in front of the entire team. She hadn't needed to raise her voice once yet, but the power in her presence was undeniable. She started by acknowledging the difficult road ahead, but she didn't mince words. What happened here was not an isolated incident, she said, her voice clear and commanding. This was a result of years of unchecked biases, of people thinking that their perception of what success looks like is the only way. But no more. We're not just changing policies, we're changing the culture. We are going to become a company that embraces diversity, inclusion, and respect not just in our words, but in everything we do. She paused for a moment, scanning the room. This is a chance for all of us to learn and grow. And if you can't embrace that, if you can't adapt, then this company is not the place for you. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling in, but as she spoke, she could feel the shift in the air, the subtle yet powerful acknowledgement that things had changed. The staff, some still stunned, some ashamed, began to understand that they were being given a choice: evolve with the company or get left behind. Vanessa continued, We are going to put into place systems that ensure this never happens again. This isn't just about making a statement. This is about building a foundation for future success. A foundation where every person is respected, where diversity isn't just tolerated but celebrated. She could feel the energy in the room slowly changing, the tension easing as her words settled in. But Vanessa knew that the real work would take time. It wasn't about what she said, it was about what everyone would do next. Over the next few months, every employee will undergo training, she continued. Not just on company policies, but on understanding the importance of inclusivity and respect, on learning what it means to be an ally. And that includes me too. We're all going to grow through this, together. After the meeting, there was a sense of cautious optimism. No one was under any illusions it would take time for the company to heal, and for the deep-rooted biases to truly be rooted out. But the wheels had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. Vanessa had made sure of that. As she left the meeting room, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She had taken control, and in doing so, had set a course for a more just and inclusive future. The road ahead would be long, but it was the road she had always known was necessary to walk, and she was ready for it. Weeks passed, and the company began to shift in ways that were impossible to ignore. Vanessa's leadership, though firm, was fair, and it was clear that the employees, many of whom had been resistant at first, were starting to understand the depth of the changes that were happening. The training programs were rolling out as planned, and every team member was required to attend. The lessons weren't just about compliance, they were about empathy, understanding, and acknowledging the biases that had been woven into the company culture for far too long. Vanessa had insisted that the training go beyond just company policies. It needed to be a cultural reset. She personally sat in on several sessions, listening, observing, and making sure the content was being delivered effectively. Carla was there too, making sure the changes were being implemented at every level. Even the most senior employees had to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session on unconscious bias, Vanessa sat in her office, staring out the window. She had achieved a victory, but it wasn't the kind that came with instant applause or public recognition. This was a long-term victory, one that would require sustained effort. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but the foundation had been laid, and she felt an unwavering sense of purpose. As the weeks went on, the results started to show. Employees were more engaged, more open to feedback, and there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The company culture, once steeped in quiet biases, was beginning to reflect the values that Vanessa had fought so hard to instill: respect, inclusion, and accountability. And yet, there were still moments when she could feel the weight of resistance, when an offhand remark or an uncomfortable silence would remind her that change was always met with some level of discomfort. But Vanessa had learned how to navigate these moments. She had learned that true leadership wasn't about avoiding discomfort, it was about embracing it and using it as fuel for progress. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Carla stopped by her desk, a slight smile on her face. "You've done it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "The shift is real. People are starting to get it." Vanessa looked up at her, grateful for the acknowledgement, but she knew the work was far from finished. "We've just scratched the surface," she replied. "There's still so much to do. But this," she paused, glancing at the team gathered in the hallway. "This is what it looks like when we start holding ourselves accountable. It's not perfect, but it's progress." The following week, Vanessa was asked to speak at a leadership summit, a platform she hadn't sought but knew she could use to further her mission. As she took the stage, she looked out at the crowd of executives, some of whom had been hesitant about the changes she had pushed for. She wasn't there to convince them of anything. She was there to share the story of what real leadership looked like, the kind of leadership that didn't shy away from hard truths and didn't back down in the face of resistance. "Leadership is about more than making decisions," she said, her voice firm and clear. "It's about building a culture of accountability, where everyone is held to the same standard, and where diversity isn't just a buzzword, it's a way of life." The room was quiet, but Vanessa could feel the shift, the subtle recognition that what she was saying was something they could no longer ignore. True leadership she continued, is about creating space for others to succeed, to thrive, regardless of their background, regardless of how they look. And if you're not doing that, you're not leading, you're just managing. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was genuine. Vanessa had made her point, and it was one that resonated far beyond that room. As she walked off the stage, she knew this moment would be another milestone in her journey. She wasn't just changing her company, she was changing the way leadership was defined. And that, she thought, was only the beginning. As the months passed, the transformation within the company became undeniable. Vanessa's leadership had set a new standard, one that had shaken the very foundations of the organization. What had once been a place where biases were tolerated, even overlooked, had now become a model of inclusivity and accountability. But as much as the company had changed, Vanessa knew the true test would always come in moments of discomfort. She was ready for it. The staff, having gone through rigorous training, now began to live out the values they had been taught. The old guard, those who had clung to outdated views and discriminatory practices, had either been let go or had stepped aside. In their place, a new wave of leadership had emerged, diverse, thoughtful, and committed to carrying the torch Vanessa had ignited. The ripple effects were visible not just in day-to-day operations, but in the company's culture and the way they approached every decision. One afternoon, as Vanessa sat in her office reviewing reports, Carla walked in with a broad smile. "You've done it, Vanessa," Carla said, her voice full of pride. "I just got off a call with the board, and they want to commend you for how far this company has come. They see the results, they're seeing the numbers, the employee engagement, the change in atmosphere." Vanessa smiled, but it was a quiet, thoughtful smile. "It's only just begun," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "We've taken the first steps. Now we need to make sure this culture remains, that it grows deeper, and that we hold ourselves accountable every single day." Carla nodded, understanding that the work was far from over. "Absolutely," she agreed. "But look at how far we've come. Look at the progress we've made. I don't think we could have achieved all of this without you." Vanessa looked out the window for a moment, her gaze steady. "I didn't do this alone," she said softly. "None of us did. But we took the first step, and now the path is clear." As Vanessa turned her attention back to the reports, she thought about the long road that had led her here, the battles fought, the people who had doubted her, the moments of resistance. But it had all been worth it. She had proven that change was possible, that progress could be made, even in the most entrenched environments. But there was still more to do. She knew this. As the CEO, she wasn't just a figurehead. She was a leader who had to remain vigilant, who had to ensure the culture of respect, inclusion, and accountability was deeply embedded into the DNA of the company. She had set the foundation, but it was up to everyone, every leader, and every employee to carry it forward. A few weeks later, Vanessa was invited to speak at a global leadership conference, an opportunity that had once seemed far off in the distance. She was introduced as a trailblazer, someone who had changed the face of corporate leadership, not just by her success, but by her commitment to making sure others succeeded as well. As she took the stage, she looked out over the crowd, an ocean of faces, some familiar, many not. But in that moment, she realized that this platform, this moment, wasn't about her. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. "Leadership is not about power," she began, her voice steady, resonating through the room. "It's about lifting others up, creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their background, can succeed. And when we do that, when we create true diversity and inclusion, we don't just change our companies, we change the world." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Vanessa had become a force, not just within her company, but in the corporate world at large. And she knew that this was only the beginning of her impact. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.